Book of Daniel, chapter 3, I'll give you a little bit of the backstory. It was a hot, dusty day, and the people were lined up, walking up the road. They were either chained together or tethered together somehow, and as they looked behind them, they could still see the smoke that used to be their city of Jerusalem. King Nebuchadnezzar had invaded Jerusalem and burned it, taken a lot of captives. There were a lot of fatalities. And he was marching the best of the people back to Babylon. That was the custom in those days. You took the best of the flocks, the best of the herds, and the best of the people, and they were going to be yours for your kingdom. And we know from our study of the Bible that we had Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men that were taken to Babylon. And they were taken into service for the king. And as time went on, we know that King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of which he could not remember. He couldn't remember the dream. He didn't know anything, didn't know how to interpret it. And as we know, the astrologers and the magicians came and said, "Oh, tell us the dream and we'll give you the interpretation." Well, they failed, as we know, and Nebuchadnezzar decreed that they should all be killed because they were a bunch of liars. Well, then somebody brought to his attention that Daniel could interpret the dream, so he called for Daniel, and Daniel gave him the dream and the interpretation. So that's all backstory to where we are in Daniel 3. And do you remember what the head of this image was made of? Gold. Okay. So Daniel said that the golden head represented Babylon. Well, King Nebuchadnezzar, the self-indulging, self-righteous monarch that he was, he decides, along with advice from his men, that he wants Babylon to last forever. So he creates an identical image, but he makes the image out of pure gold to symbolize that Babylon will last forever, although he fails to remember that Daniel's interpretation says the gold will give way to the silver and so on. So in Daniel 3, Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 90 feet. Can you imagine something 90 feet tall? I don't know how high the ceiling is, but it's probably a good 2 or 3 times higher than this ceiling. And he decided to gather all the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, counselors, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to dedicate this golden image. So they did. They all came and gathered together in this plain of Dura where the image had been erected. Ellen White, in her book Prophets and Kings, gives a little bit of insight to the first dream. For a time afterwards, Daniel's interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar was influenced by the fear of God, but his heart was not yet cleansed from this self-exaltation. The words, "Thou art the head of gold," had made a deep impression on his mind. And so thus his advisors suggested making this image, but making it entirely out of gold. So we get down to verse 4, and they announced that they were going to play the music, and that whenever they heard the music, the entire assembly was to bow the knee and worship this image. And there was a penalty in verse 6. Whoever does not fall down and worship the image shall the same hour be cast into the fiery furnace, the burning fiery furnace. So, the music played, and you just saw people drop like dominoes, plop, 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 right down on their knees to worship the image. However, there were some who didn't bow. We are told not all had bowed the knee to this idolatrous symbol of human power. 3 of the captives from Judah firmly resolved not to dishonor God. How long do you think it took that news to reach the king? Some of the same men, I would imagine some of the same men who had been saved from the sword by Daniel's interpretation, they turned and they ran to the king. "O king, didn't you make a decree that everyone should worship your golden image?" And he said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, there's 3 slave boys that you brought from Jerusalem, and they are standing straight as an arrow. And their Babylonian names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." And the king was told that these men did not honor his command. So, verse 13 of Daniel 3, Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and fury commanded to bring these men to him, and they were brought to the king. Can you imagine? Nebuchadnezzar at the time was the most powerful ruler on earth, and he was not about to be challenged. And here are 3 men, and these are not just men, they are slave men that he has brought back from war. And they dare defy his command. He said, "Is it true that you do not serve my gods, nor worship this image which I have set up?" He said, "Now, I'll give you another chance." Nebuchadnezzar decided he was a reasonable man. Although he was angry, he decided to give them one more chance, because he again pointed to the flames of the furnace if they should dare disobey. And he said again, "When you hear the music, fall down and worship. But if you don't, you will be cast into the burning fiery furnace." Verse 16, they answered the king, "O king, we are not careful to answer you in this matter." And I have often wondered what they meant. That's the King James Version, says, "We are not careful to answer you." And I often wondered what that meant. And in my study, I came across, we're not going to call a board meeting to discuss this. We're not going to call a council meeting and have to decide, how are we going to vote. Whatever happens, we are not going to bow to this image. And it's interesting how they say, verse 17, "If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us. But if not, be it known, O king, we will not serve your gods, nor worship this golden image." And basically, it was bow or burn. The king gave him 2 options, bow or burn. So, they have done medical studies or scientific studies, and there is a certain condition when you get so angry, a person can get so lividly angry that they are temporarily insane. And I believe that happened to Nebuchadnezzar here, because it said, then, verse 19, "Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed." That means his facial expression changed. And he was so angry, he was so full of rage, he was temporarily insane. He ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter. Now, did he think that those flames were going to burn those men the way they were? But he ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter. And he then called for the strongest soldiers to bind up the Hebrews and throw them into the fire. And you know they did, but what happened? The heat of the fire killed those soldiers. They were the strongest soldiers in the army, and they were killed. And they didn't even stop they just threw them in, and then the soldiers died. So the king commanded the mighty men to bind them and throw them into the furnace. And so they were thrown in. But then what happens? Verse 24. Nebuchadnezzar is astonished as he looks. And he says, "Didn't we throw 3 men into the fire?" And his men say, "Yes." Then the king says, "But I see 4 men walking into the fire. They are not tied up, they're not burned, and the 4th man looks like the Son of God." How did he recognize the Son of God? I did a little bit of study into Ellen White's. She talks about this in Prophets and Kings. And these Hebrews, when they had been taken to Babylon, they were to serve in the king's service, and they did their job well. They had fulfilled their duties in positions of trust. They had given a reason for their faith. They had given a reason for their faith without hesitating, even while staring death in the face. And so God rewarded them by coming and walking with them in the midst of the fire. Did he pull them out of the fire? No, he walked in the fire with them. This is encouragement for us. When we're going through trials and tribulations, and we pray to God, God may not just pull us immediately out of the situation, but God jumps in there with us. And God goes with us through the fire, through the flood, through, you fill in the blank. So, Nebuchadnezzar comes near, verse 26, he comes near to the furnace. I suppose with it being as hot as it was, he probably had to stay quite a distance, but he shouted for them to come out. And they did come out. And the only thing that was burned were the bonds that had tied their hands. Then Nebuchadnezzar praises the God of the Hebrews and admits that God had sent his angel, because in his arrogance, Nebuchadnezzar had told the Hebrews, "What God is able to save you from my hand?" when he ordered that furnace to be heated 7 times hotter. And yet, after they are miraculously spared, then he turns around and says, "Praise the God of heaven. God sent an angel." God worked a miracle to save these 3 who were so faithful to him no matter what. And that is so encouraging for us to be faithful no matter what is facing us. Be faithful, be strong. God worked a miracle back then. God still works miracles today. I would like to share a story with you that I got off of Facebook from the Auburn Academy Adventist pastor. Pastor Rome Yulia, I had to ask somebody how to pronounce that. Pastor Rome Yulia is the pastor of the Auburn Adventist Academy Church. Friday, March 18th, 2022, Pastor Rome got up around 2 a.m. to open a Zoom meeting for the North New Zealand youth. Now remember, New Zealand is quite a time difference from us. So here he is up at 2 a.m. to do a sermon for New Zealand. Then at 3:30, he switches over and does a Zoom Bible study for a group in Australia. So this is very, very early in the morning. So after his Bible study and his sermon, he goes to bed exhausted. But then it was up at 7 a.m. to give chapel at the elementary school across the street, Buena Vista, across the street from where he lived. So he had to be up at 7 for the chapel worship. So his wife, Ketty, took their 12-year-old daughter, Sophia, to school in Federal Way, and I walked 8-year-old Nettie to Buena Vista. My 2 older children, Christina, 15, and Israel, 14, were both home ill. Right after my chapel, I went and had brunch with another Adventist pastor, Pastor Iwanku. Pastor Iwanku dropped me off at home around 2 p.m., Pastor Rome said. Pastor Rome said he was exhausted and needed to take a nap. Suddenly, he remembered an upcoming funeral service that he was conducting that coming Sunday. So forget the nap. He had to go work on his funeral sermon. His wife was getting ready to leave for Starbucks with their daughter Christina, and he asked to catch a ride to the church because they lived here, Buena Vista's here, the church is down here, and the church is as you leave the campus to go out to town. So they said they would drop him off, and so this is about 2 p.m. now, and the family went on to Starbucks. But before they left, Pastor asked about the 8-year-old Nettie. What are we going to do when school's out? And his wife said, Pastor's wife said that the aunt was coming to take her home. So that's where they left. He was working at the church. And they left to go to Starbucks. About 45 minutes later, my church, the office secretary, noticed fire trucks speeding past the church. She yelled for me, "Rome, call your family. See if they are all right." My wife didn't answer the phone, he says. Pastor Rome knew by now that Nettie and Israel were at home because Israel was homesick. Christina had gone with her mother. Nettie had been taken home from school, so now it was Nettie and Israel at home. All of a sudden, a church member came screeching into the parking lot in her car and screamed words that you never want to hear. "Rome, your house is on fire." Jumping into her car, they raced down the road. Fire trucks and police cars were everywhere. Pastor Rome leaped from the car and began running toward the house. He spotted Israel sitting on the back of a fire engine, and he appeared to be injured. "Where's your sister?" he screamed. Israel looked at his father and then looked away with a hopeless expression. I then screamed to the firemen that my daughter was in the house, but there was nothing they could do. The flames had completely engulfed the house. Pastor Rome stood there in horror, imagining his daughter in that horrible place. 10 minutes passed, which seemed like an eternity. Suddenly, another church member, a lot of church members had gathered around, and another church member shouted, "Rome, here's Ketty, your wife, and she has the girls. She has all 3 girls." Pastor Rome was in complete shock. Everything he knew convinced him that Nettie, the 8-year-old, was not with his wife, except for one important fact. Ketty, the wife, and Christina, the 15-year-old, had dropped Pastor Rome off at the church office. Before heading to Starbucks, they said, it's too bad that Nettie's going to miss out on this. So turning around, they headed back to the house and picked up Nettie, just as she was going up the stairs. They couldn't wake Israel up, so they just took Nettie and left. Soon after they left, Israel woke up and saw the ceiling covered in billowing black smoke. He looked at the bedroom door and could see flames licking at the bottom of the door. So he knew he couldn't open the door, but he knew something was terribly wrong. But Israel remembered. Here he's 14 years old. He remembered 2 months earlier, Pastor Rome had a nightmare And in the nightmare, his house was completely engulfed in fire. The nightmare shook him so badly that he developed a fire drill, and he put his family through that fire drill. Because of that drill, Israel knew how to get out. He did not open the bedroom door. Instead, he smashed the bedroom window and jumped out, but it was the second floor, so he had quite a jump. Pastor Rome came around to Israel, who was now in an ambulance. You should have seen the relief on his face. Then he melted into tears as we sat next to each other celebrating God's goodness. Pastor Rome says he's lost most of his material things. He put a picture of his ministerial credentials on Facebook, and it's pretty well charred. You can barely see the name of the institution. But he said that doesn't matter. What matters is I have my family. I have my family. And he claims Isaiah chapter 43. And it's in your bulletin if you want to take your bulletin. Isaiah 43, verse 2. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. God was with those 3 Hebrews in the fiery furnace. God was with Pastor Rome and his family. God sends his angels to protect us. He sent angels to protect them. He sent angels to protect the Hebrews. And God's own Son walked in the middle of the fiery furnace. And that is encouragement for us. When we're walking through trials and tribulations, God will be with us. So, that's my sermon for today. Don't forget, God is with you. Grace and peace be unto you from him which is, and which was, and which is to come. To him be glory and honor and blessing now and forever and ever. Amen.